I'm Becky Caldwell, 34. The soldier daughter my family branded useless. At every table, Ethan shone. Their golden boy, their empire builder. I? A shadow they tolerated, never praised. But the day of my father's funeral, Ethan raised a glass over the coffin and called me the useless soldier. That moment changed everything. Ever been mocked by the very people meant to protect you? Hit like if you've ever been dismissed in your own family. Comment if someone else's spotlight erased you. It began there in the church, heavy with lilies and silence, when his smirk cut deeper than grief itself. The weight of his words pressed harder than the scent of lilies or the organ's low hum. Years had passed since I'd heard his voice directly aimed at me, yet nothing in his tone had changed, still coated with the same venom he had spilled when we were children. I stood at the back of the church, uniform pressed, shoulders straight, every ribbon a reminder of 17 years that had been carved out of deserts and war zones. None of it mattered to him. None of it mattered to anyone here, it seemed. Murmurs flickered like restless moths in the pews. Ants leaned closer to one another, lips twitching with half-hidden amusement. A cousin stifled a chuckle. Even the pastor, pausing briefly, allowed the silence to swallow the insult before resuming the prayer. I could feel their eyes crawling over me, measuring me against the brother who raised his glass as though the funeral were merely another one of his soirees. I clenched my jaw, fighting the familiar urge to answer back. But I had learned long ago that silence could wound sharper than a blade. In combat zones, silence saved lives. Here, it cut through the pretense that Ethan draped himself in, leaving his cruelty to echo unchecked in the vaulted ceiling. He turned to his audience, reveling in the attention. His suit, perfectly tailored, glistened under the weak light of stained glass. He basked in their approval, as if he were the host of some twisted celebration rather than a grieving son. "You'd think after all those years she'd have something to show for it," he continued, smirk deepening. "But medals don't feed families, do they? Medals don't build empires." The laugh that followed from his circle of admirers felt rehearsed, sycophantic. It was easier for them to laugh than to risk his disdain. My mother's eyes stayed fixed on the coffin, her lips pale, unmoving. She would never defend me. She never had. My father, the man we buried, had been the only one who saw me as more than a shadow trailing Ethan. I kept my breathing steady, the military cadence ingrained too deeply to break. In my mind, I replayed the sound of boots on gravel, the crisp snap of salutes, the trust of men and women who had fought beside me. They had never called me useless. They had called me lieutenant, comrade, friend. Ethan's voice was the only one that still called me less than I was. The coffin lowered with solemn ceremony, yet his grin lingered, a grotesque flourish against the quiet grief. I caught the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth when he realized I would not respond. He hated that more than any rebuttal. For him, victory came in drawing blood. My refusal denied him that satisfaction. As mourners filed out, I moved toward the small table laid out with condolence cards, notes, and keepsakes left by neighbors. My hand brushed against the edge of an envelope heavier than the rest. Gold-embossed lettering gleamed in the dim light. My stomach tightened as I turned it over. Among the sympathy notes and flowers, Becky notices Ethan's lavish wedding invitation lying among condolence cards. The gilded envelope feels more like a challenge than a celebration. Its weight lingers in my hands as if the thick cardstock carried not joy but some veiled provocation. Even now, seated at a corner table in the local cafe, I can't shake the way the gold lettering had gleamed beneath the funeral home's dim lights. Who drops a wedding invitation in a stack of condolence cards? Only Ethan, so certain of his superiority that he would twist grief into another showcase of his triumph. The cafe is quieter than I remembered. Years of sandstorms and barracks had dulled my memory of ordinary sounds, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scrape of spoons against ceramic mugs, the tinny jazz drifting from an old speaker. My palms warm against the mug of coffee, but the unease in my chest refuses to settle. Mark Rivera slides into the seat opposite me, his frame still broad despite the years since our deployments together. His jacket is worn, not from fashion but from use. A badge no longer hangs on his belt, but the air of vigilance hasn't left him. His eyes track every movement in the cafe before settling on me with a mix of warmth and wariness. "You're hard to track down," he says, voice low but familiar. "Word gets around fast when Becky Caldwell sets foot back in town." I manage a faint smile. "And what word is that? The useless soldier back to haunt her brother's empire." His jaw tightens, but he doesn't take the bait. Instead, he nods at the shimmering invitation lying face up on the table between us. That thing been staring at you since I walked in. I exhale slowly, tracing a fingertip along the embossed edge. Found it at the funeral, tossed in with the condolences. Ethan never misses a chance to gloat. Look at this thing, it's not an invitation, it's a declaration. Mark leans back, studying me for a moment before lifting his cup. Funny you say that. Rumors have been circling about a certain successful local businessman whose sudden fortune caught some eyes in the bureau. The words land heavier than I expect. I tilt my head. You're saying Ethan? I'm not saying names, his gaze sharpens. But the bureau doesn't like unexplained empires rising out of nowhere. Money like that doesn't appear cleanly in small towns, not with the kind of arrogance your brother flaunts. I think of the suit, the glass of bourbon, the smug smirk he wore at our father's funeral, the way he reveled in putting me down, in proving to every relative that I was a relic of failure. And then the invitation the hotel ballroom embossed on the card, the imported wine list tucked into the envelope, every detail screaming excess. My unease shifts into something colder. He's always had a taste for the grand, I murmur. But this feels like more than ego. It feels tainted. Mark leans forward now, lowering his voice. You know the thing about glitter, Becky? Don't be fooled by it. Sometimes it hides rot. The cafe hum continues around us. Cutlery clinks. Doors swing. Strangers laugh. But my world narrows to the golden envelope lying on the table. My fingers press against its surface, as though the pressure could force it to reveal its secrets. For the first time in years, my stomach tightens not from war memories, but from the suspicion that Ethan's empire might not just be built on arrogance. It might be built on something rotten. Becky studies the invitation again. Her stomach tightens. Around the dinner table, success had only one name, Ethan Caldwell. The chandelier glowed overhead, scattering golden light across polished mahogany, crystal glasses, and a spread that looked stolen from a magazine. Roasted duck, imported wine, silver cutlery perfectly aligned Ethan's signature extravagance. I had barely set foot in the estate's dining room before I felt the weight of its familiar judgment. Time hadn't dulled the scent of polish and money. It reeked of him. Every chair was filled. Aunts and uncles I barely remembered leaned in, their smiles too eager when Ethan spoke, their laughter too loud at his every joke. My mother sat stiff at the far end, eyes avoiding mine, while Ethan commanded the room with the poise of a king hosting court. Remarkable quarter, Uncle Harold declared, lifting his glass. The Caldwell name has never shined brighter, thanks to Ethan. His investments are genius, another relative chimed in. Not many men can build an empire in just a few years. Their words piled higher than the serving platters. A banquet of adoration. My fork clinked against the porcelain plate, each sound a reminder of my silence. They hadn't asked where I'd been, hadn't wondered what 17 years of service looked like. Only Ethan mattered here. Between bites of perfectly seared meat, the conversation shifted toward me, though not with curiosity, only with judgment draped in politeness. It must be lonely, Becky, Aunt Caroline said, her tone drenched in pity. No husband, no children, just you and your memories, and no business to show for it, Cousin Daniel added with a smirk. But hey, at least you've got medals. Those must shine nicely in the dark. Their chuckles rang like cutlery dropped on marble. I kept my eyes steady on my plate, letting the bitterness pool inside my chest instead of spilling onto the tablecloth. Ethan leaned back, swirling his wine, his grin sharpened by the rim of the glass. She served the country, he said, as if praising me. But then his smirk widened, though one wonders was it patriotism, or simply because she couldn't serve success anywhere else? A ripple of laughter broke out, the family echo chamber feeding his cruelty. His words sliced deeper than the funeral mockery because here, at this table, they applauded. Here, he rewrote the truth. I felt the letter pressing against my thigh, folded carefully in my pocket. My father's last words, sealed in his handwriting, the only voice that might cut through Ethan's chorus of lies. My fingers tightened around it beneath the table, as though gripping a weapon unseen. Becky grips a sealed letter from her late father, hidden in her pocket. My father's handwriting shakes, but his words cut sharper than any blade. The envelope tears slowly in my hands, the seal reluctant to break, as if the paper itself knows what kind of truth lies within. I sit on the edge of the bed in my childhood room, a room frozen in time with faded posters and shelves stacked with dust-coated books. The house sleeps around me, its silence pierced only by the tick of the old clock on the dresser. Outside, April rain taps against the window pane, steady and unyielding. I unfold the letter. The ink stutters where his hand must have trembled, but the tone, firm, deliberate, pulls me back into his voice. Becky, if you are reading this, it means I have left you with more than grief. You must know, Ethan's empire is not what it seems. He shines too brightly, because the light hides shadows. The wealth he boasts of is not clean, and the Caldwell name is sliding into corruption under his hand. I ask you no, I beg you to protect the honor of our family when I no longer can. The words blur, though not from the ink. I swipe at my eyes, my breath uneven. For years I thought my silence was strength, that walking away from this house, from him, was the only way to survive. But my father had seen through Ethan even as the rest of the family clapped and toasted. He knew the truth, and he passed that burden to me. My fingers tighten around the fragile paper. Doubt stirs inside me. Why me? I am the one they mock, the one they discard, the soldier who returned home with no medals visible to them. My brother commands rooms, commands fortunes, commands lies. And I, what do I command? The rain grows heavier, matching the rhythm of my pulse. I hear my father's voice in my head again, softer this time, almost pleading. Protect the honor. I rise and pace the room, each step pulling me from hesitation toward resolve. My reflection in the window shows a woman wearier than the girl who once lived here, but steadier too. The years of war gave me discipline, gave me patience. Perhaps this is the war my father meant for me to fight. I'll attend the wedding, but not as a guest. The whisper escapes into the dark room, an oath signed in silence. I reach for my phone, my hand trembling less than my father's had when he wrote those words. My thumb hovers only a second before pressing Mark's name. When he answers, his voice gruff with sleep. I don't waste a moment. I think I have what you've been looking for. In every corner of the bar, Ethan's name was on someone's lips, and not all in praise. The place smelled of old wood and spilled beer, its walls lined with neon signs that flickered unevenly. A Friday night crowd pressed in tight, voices rising above the jukebox, but the sound kept circling back to one subject. Ethan Caldwell, my brother, the golden businessman of this small town, whose shadow stretched further than any neon glow. I sat in a booth with Mark, nursing a drink I barely touched. From across the room, snippets reached us. He bought that hotel cash. No way that money's clean. FBI won't look away forever. The words slipped between laughter and lowered tones, carried like rumors of a storm no one wanted to stand in. I felt my jaw clench. It wasn't just me anymore. The town was starting to doubt the shine. Mark leaned closer, his voice low but steady. See? You're not imagining it. These people know something's off. They just don't have the guts to say it out loud in daylight. His eyes flicked toward the bar's door, where a woman slipped inside, her posture stiff, her eyes darting quickly around the room. Sarah Collins. Our cousin. She worked inside Ethan's company close enough to see the gears grinding. She approached the booth, her coat still clutched tight even in the warmth. We shouldn't talk long, she whispered, sliding into the seat across from me. Her hands trembled as she pulled off her gloves. If he knew I was here... She didn't finish the thought. I held her gaze. You've seen it, haven't you? The lies. The books. Sarah bit her lip, glancing at Mark before lowering her voice further. It's worse than you think. The company isn't just skimming or cheating clients. There's money moving large sums, routed through shell accounts. It's laundering. Plain and simple. The noise of the bar seemed to fade, the air thickening between us. She dug into her purse, fumbling with a small flash drive. I copied files, emails, transfers, enough to prove fraud 100 times over. But if this gets out, Ethan won't just come after me. He'll ruin everyone who ever stood in his way. Mark leaned back, whistling under his breath. That's exactly the kind of thing federal agents dream about. You're handing them dynamite. Sarah's fingers trembled as she set the drive on the table, its metallic edge catching the light. This will burn his world down. I stared at it, the weight of my father's words echoing in my chest. The burden wasn't mine alone anymore. The bar felt suddenly smaller, the whispers around us pressing tighter, the walls inching closer. Through the window, the hotel across the street glowed bright against the night. A massive banner draped down its side. The Caldwell wedding, one night of splendor. My stomach tightened, the letters shimmering like a taunt from Ethan himself. Ethan's smile was polished, but his words were knives. The Caldwell mansion pulsed with light, chandeliers scattering gold across the marble floor, the kind of ostentatious display that made outsiders whisper about untouchable wealth. Inside, the crowd buzzed with the shallow hum of elite conversation investors, family friends, business partners, all dressed in glittering attire. Waiters glided by with trays of champagne, their silence only emphasizing the din of practiced laughter. I slipped into the room almost unnoticed, my black dress plain compared to sequins and pearls. Conversations hardly paused. To most of them, I wasn't a guest, just a footnote. My family passed me like a ghost, eyes sliding away, embarrassed to acknowledge the soldier who'd returned without a fortune or a title. From across the hall, Ethan's voice rose above the murmur, commanding attention as easily as flipping a switch. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes, each gesture designed for the spotlight. Rachel stood by his side, her bridal glow dulled by nervous tension. She smiled when expected, but her hands twisted around the stem of her glass as if she longed for escape. I felt his eyes land on me. The smirk spread slowly, rehearsed, like an actor preparing for the line he had been waiting to deliver. "Ah, look who graced us," Ethan said, his tone sugared but dripping with malice. "My sister, the war hero without a war, the guest of honor without the honor." Laughter rippled through a cluster of relatives, eager to stay in his orbit. I held his gaze, forcing my face to remain neutral. The sting I might have felt weeks ago dulled now to cold calculation. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, brushing his arm. "Ethan, maybe," she began. Her voice soft, but he brushed her off with a quick, charming smile that never reached his eyes. He lifted his glass high, and silence spread across the room like spilled ink. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone theatrical, "a toast." Guests turned, eager to join. "To my sister, Becky Caldwell, proof that failure can wear medals." The room erupted with polite chuckles, though a few glances darted toward me, uneasy. The champagne in his glass sparkled beneath the chandelier, as he tipped it back, triumphant. I felt the heat of dozens of eyes, but instead of flinching, I let a slow smile curve my lips. It was measured, quiet, unsettling in its calm. I raised my own glass without a word, meeting his stare with one that no longer yielded. For the first time that evening, Ethan's grin faltered not much, but enough. The shine in his eyes flickered, as though he realized the sister he mocked wasn't standing defenseless anymore. Sarah's hands trembled as she slid the USB across the bench. The night air carried a faint chill, scented with trimmed roses and damp earth from the Caldwell garden. Beyond the glass walls of the mansion, laughter and clinking glasses rang out from Ethan's cocktail party, the sound of wealth and vanity. Out here, under dim garden lamps, everything felt stripped of glamour, just shadows, secrets, and three people caught in the weight of truth. I sat on the weathered bench, the USB between us like a weapon disguised in plastic. Sarah wouldn't meet my eyes at first. Her breath came quick, uneven. "I shouldn't even be here," she whispered. "If Ethan finds out, I'm done. He'll ruin me." Mark leaned against the bench's edge, his posture casual but his jaw set. Even in the quiet, his cop instincts radiated alert, protective, ready for confrontation. "You already were in danger the moment you worked for him," he said. "But you're not alone anymore." Finally, Sarah looked at me. Her green eyes glistened under the lamp. "I worked in his accounting division. For 2 years, I watched him shift numbers, bury transactions. At first, I thought it was clever bookkeeping. Then I realized it was fraud, Becky. And not small. International wires, shell companies, fake invoices, millions." She pressed her hands together, knuckles white. "I saved what I could. That drive has everything." I picked up the USB, its tiny body cold against my palm. 1,000 thoughts raced through me. The humiliation at the funeral, Ethan's mocking toasts, the family's blind adoration. And beneath it all, my father's words echoing from the letter, "Shiny lies." Mark crouched in front of us, lowering his voice. "This is enough to bury him if it's clean and verifiable. The FBI won't touch gossip, but hard numbers?" He gave a short nod. "That's the kind of firepower we need." Sarah's lip quivered. "Promise me you'll protect me. If he knows I leaked this," I reached out, covering her trembling hands with mine. "He'll never know. Whatever happens, your name stays out of this. You've done the bravest thing anyone could." Her shoulders shook once, then steadied. She nodded, though fear lingered in every breath. I slipped the USB into my laptop, the glow of the screen throwing pale light across our faces. Folders opened, spreadsheets bloomed across the display, numbers stacked in columns, transfers logged with precision, company accounts tied to offshore havens. As I scrolled, my pulse thundered louder. It wasn't just fraud. It was an empire built on deception. The weight of it pressed down on me. Proof undeniable. Evidence that could shatter Ethan's golden facade in a single stroke. Mark's eyes scanned the data over my shoulder. His breath hissed through his teeth. "This isn't just shady," he muttered. "It's criminal, across state and federal lines." I closed the laptop, slipping the drive back into my pocket. My hands steadied, my resolve sharper than ever. "With this," Mark said, his voice low and certain, "he's finished." Every chandelier gleamed, but I saw only cracks in the glass. The hotel ballroom roared with music and laughter, crystal fixtures scattering light across marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. Gilded drapes framed towering windows, and the air smelled of expensive wine and moneyed arrogance. To the untrained eye, it was the picture of success. To me, it was camouflage, a mask stretched too tightly over decay. Ethan basked in the spotlight, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his arm draped around Rachel's shoulders. His laughter rolled through the room, bigger than life, each gesture rehearsed to draw applause from the crowd. Guests pressed closer, eager for his approval. He bragged openly of his latest ventures, painting himself as the king of small-town New Jersey turned global powerhouse. From modest roots, he boasted, to partnerships in Europe, Asia, even South America. "The Caldwells don't just survive, we dominate." The crowd applauded, but I caught the slight tremor in Rachel's hands as she raised her glass. Her smile faltered whenever Ethan turned away, and her gaze darted across the room as though searching for an exit. When her eyes brushed mine, they lingered a moment too long, silently pleading. The bride-to-be wasn't basking in glory, she was trapped in it. I let my gaze sweep the room. Near the bar, two men stood apart, their suits plain, their expressions detached. They weren't clinking glasses or laughing at Ethan's jokes. They scanned the crowd with sharp eyes, nodding occasionally to one another. Their stillness screamed louder than the music. They didn't belong, which meant only one thing. The bureau was here. Mark caught my glance from across the room, his hand brushing his phone, his chin dipping in confirmation. The noose was tightening, and Ethan had no idea. I stayed near the edge of the ballroom, half listening as relatives praised Ethan's incredible achievements and unshakable business sense. Their blind loyalty stung, but it also fueled the fire burning steady inside me. I remembered my father's letter, "Shiny lies, Becky. Don't be fooled by the glitter." Every sparkle above me only deepened my resolve. The band shifted into a softer melody, couples drifting to the dance floor. I pulled out my phone under the tablecloth, the screen lighting my face in the dim glow. A single message blinked across: "Stay calm. Action soon." My breath caught, though I forced my expression into casual disinterest. The bureau wasn't waiting for rumor anymore, they were preparing to strike. Ethan moved toward me then, cutting through the dancers, his smile razor-sharp. He leaned down, his cologne sharp, his voice low enough that only I heard. "Tomorrow," he whispered, the words wrapped in venom, "you'll see who really wins." And for the first time that night, I let myself wonder who would fall harder when the glitter shattered. When he held her hand at the altar, I knew the show was almost over. The cathedral swelled with golden light pouring through stained glass windows, colors spilling like spilled paint across polished stone floors. White flowers lined the aisles, their fragrance thick and suffocating in the warm May air. The pews overflowed with relatives, business associates, and community leaders, all dressed in their finest, all eager to witness the spectacle of Ethan Caldwell's crowning moment. Ethan stood tall at the altar, his tuxedo crisp, his smile designed to dazzle every camera lens. To most, he looked like a man at the peak of triumph, a brother, son, and groom wrapped in adoration. But when his gaze slid toward me, just for a flicker, his smirk turned sharp, private, venom, aimed squarely at me. "See, Becky, I win." Rachel, in her ivory gown, was luminous but not in joy. Her fingers twitched nervously against the bouquet, and when Ethan clasped her hand, I saw her knuckles blanch white. She glanced at the guests, her mother, the priest, then hesitantly at me. Our eyes locked, and I caught the faint tremor in her lips, as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. The priest's voice rose, steady and reverent, reciting the age-old vows. Ethan repeated them with arrogance, his tone more like a declaration of ownership than love. To have and to hold, from this day forward. He paused, letting the words echo, his chin lifted proudly, daring anyone to doubt him. When it was Rachel's turn, silence seemed to stretch. Her voice wavered on the first line. To have and to hold. She swallowed, her throat tightening, her words quivering like fragile glass. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, subtle but commanding, his smile never faltering. I leaned forward slightly in my pew, heart pounding, every instinct sharpened by years of reading faces, of detecting weakness in tense rooms. Rachel's eyes darted toward me again. That glance carried more weight than all the vows, fear, desperation, and something else, a plea. Help me. The organ swelled behind us, the music a tide of grandeur, but to me it felt like a drumbeat toward collapse. I scanned the edges of the cathedral. 2 men near the back stood straighter than the rest, not smiling, not whispering. Their focus wasn't on the bride or groom, but on the exits, on the crowd. Plainclothes, FBI, coiled springs, hidden in suits. Rachel's voice caught again, breaking on the words, for richer, for poorer. Her bouquet trembled. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his lips brushing her ear, his whisper unseen by others. She froze, forcing herself through the last of the vows, her tone mechanical, brittle. And then, just as the priest lifted his hands to bless the union, just as the tension strangled the air, an abrupt, shrill sound shattered the moment. A phone rang loudly in the cathedral, its jarring tones slicing through prayers and vows alike. The crowd hushed instantly, heads whipping toward the sound. The music faltered, the priest hesitated, and Rachel's bouquet slipped half an inch in her grip. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. One call, and Ethan's kingdom crumbled. The shrill ring echoed off the cathedral walls, slicing through the solemnity of stained glass and organ music. For a suspended breath, no one moved. Dozens of heads swiveled, scanning the rows of guests for the source of the sound. Then the heavy oak doors at the back groaned open, and men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence consuming the air. The FBI had arrived. The lead agent raised his voice, authoritative and unwavering. Ethan Caldwell, you are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Step away from the altar. His words reverberated like thunder, scattering gasps through the congregation. Ethan's confident smirk faltered, but only for an instant. He straightened, tugging Rachel protectively closer as though to shield himself in the image of marriage. This is outrageous, he boomed, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings. A mistake, a smear campaign. I am in the middle of my wedding. The agents advanced, their movements crisp and inevitable. Guests shifted nervously in their seats, whispers rising like waves. Some clutched their pearls, others fumbled for their phones, already recording the collapse of the man they had toasted just nights before. Rachel stood rigid beside him, her bouquet slipping, petals scattering across the stone floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, torn between loyalty and terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came, her voice trapped under the weight of spectacle and shame. Ethan lashed out, his arrogance curdling into rage. Do you know who I am? He snarled. I built this city's wealth. You think you can march in here and humiliate me on my wedding day? His words cracked, the raw edge of desperation beneath the bluster. The lead agent's expression didn't flicker. He stepped closer, producing the warrant, his tone unshaken. We're not here for speeches, Mr. Caldwell. Hands behind your back. Rachel swayed as Ethan's fingers finally unclenched from hers, his last grip of control severed. He shoved against the agents, but the struggle was brief, his wrists twisted behind him, steel cuffs snapping closed with an audible click that rang louder than any vow. The cathedral erupted. Guests rose in shock, some protesting, others whispering accusations they had long suspected. Cameras flashed, recording the instant the empire of Ethan Caldwell toppled before the eyes of everyone who once adored him. For years he had mocked me, diminished me, painted me as a shadow in his spotlight. But as the agents dragged him from the altar, his face red, his voice breaking in sputtered protests, he looked not like a king dethroned, but a child caught in his own lies. I stepped into the aisle, steady, unshaken, every eye following. Ethan's gaze found mine, and in it burned fury, betrayal, and the dawning recognition that I had been waiting for this moment all along. I didn't speak. I only held his eyes as the doors slammed shut behind him, the echo sealing his downfall. The wedding hall reaped not of champagne, but of shame. Moments earlier, the grand ballroom had throbbed with the shimmer of crystal glasses and the hum of polite applause. Now, the chandeliers still blazed, but their brilliance only illuminated the ruin. Guests surged toward the exits in a tide of panic, heels clattering, suits brushing past overturned chairs. $1,000 cake stood abandoned, its frosted tiers sagging under the weight of uneaten roses, while champagne flutes toppled and fizzed into silence. The echo of Ethan's arrest lingered like smoke. He was still visible through the glass doors, handcuffed, flanked by two agents who steered him like a spectacle. Every step he took dragged whispers behind him, some shocked, some gloating, many greedy for gossip. The name Caldwell no longer carried prestige but scandal, and every camera phone in the room had captured the fall. Rachel crumpled beside the head table, her white gown pooling like spilt milk across the floor. Mascara streamed down her cheeks, and her sobs clawed at the air. A woman who had rehearsed her smile for weeks was now bare-faced, humiliated before hundreds. Bridesmaids hovered, useless, muttering half-hearted consolations before retreating to nurse their own fear of association. Becky did not move to comfort her. She stood a few paces away, rooted like stone, the weight of years pressing on her shoulders. She had imagined this downfall 100 ways, but reality was stranger, raw, filled with the chaos of crumbling illusions. Guests stared as they passed her, some with sympathy, others with suspicion, and more than one with awe at the sister who had once been mocked as useless. Ethan, restrained and red-faced, twisted in the agent's grip to hurl his final weapon. His voice, sharp with fury, cut across the ballroom. "She did this! My sister ruined me!" The words echoed, bouncing against gilt walls, splintering what little dignity he had left. Fingers pointed, heads turned. For an instant, Becky was under the harsh light of collective judgment. But she didn't flinch. The years of silence, of swallowing insults, had prepared her for this. Let them look, let them wonder. She had no need to defend herself. Rachel lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes trembling with betrayal and realization. Her lips moved, fragile and shaking, carrying words barely louder than breath. "You knew, didn't you?" The question hung like a blade between them, sharp enough to wound, heavy enough to demand an answer that would not come, not yet. In the side chamber, the family's grief turned into fury. The waiting room was meant for quiet reflection plush armchairs, a tray of untouched mints, heavy curtains muting the chaos outside. Instead, it had become a tribunal. The Caldwell relatives circled like hawks, their whispers sharpened into accusations, their sorrow hardened into blame. The scent of spilled perfume mingled with sweat and anger, and Becky stood in the middle as if on trial. "You humiliated him," her aunt snapped, pointing a trembling finger. "At his wedding, no less." Another uncle's voice followed, hoarse with rage. "Do you think exposing your own brother makes you noble? Blood is blood, Rebecca. You've turned against your family." Their mother sat rigid on the couch, face pale, hands clasped so tightly the veins stood out like ropes. She did not raise her voice, but her silence burned hotter than their shouts. Every glance from the older relatives carried years of bias. Ethan was the golden child. Becky the scarred soldier who had never fit their mold. Tonight gave them reason to cement that divide. Becky's pulse pounded, but her voice remained steady. "You saw the handcuffs. You heard the charges. I didn't put them on him, the FBI did." "Don't twist this," her cousin barked. "You whispered to them. You wanted this." The words were knives, but Becky did not bleed. She had been trained for war, and though these were her kin, their venom was weaker than bullets. She looked at their faces, some red with drink, others damp with tears, and realized they weren't grieving Ethan's sins. They were grieving the collapse of their own illusions, their comfortable life funded by his lies. Mark stepped forward from the corner, his presence cutting through the storm. His voice carried the authority of a man who had worn a badge. This wasn't her choice. It was the law. Ethan built his empire on fraud, and it was bound to fall. Don't blame her for the truth finally catching up. The room stilled, though eyes still burned with hostility. Becky reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing the small piece of plastic that weighed heavier than any weapon she'd carried in combat. She placed Sarah's USB drive onto the coffee table. Its metallic glint caught the lamplight. "Here," Becky said, her voice low but unshakable. "Proof. Falsified records. Money laundered through shell companies. Deals that never existed. He forged everything, and Sarah saw it with her own eyes." The relatives leaned in, some recoiling, others glaring harder, as if the evidence itself was betrayal. For Becky, the act was both confession and shield, the truth laid bare, beyond her control, beyond their denials. Her mother finally spoke, her voice a hiss that sliced the air. "You'll never be forgiven." The words clung to Becky like frost, heavier than any battlefield curse, colder than the handcuffs that had bound her brother. Not all victims wore uniforms, some wore wedding dresses. The hotel suite was a mausoleum of roses. Bouquets, meant to symbolize joy, lay crushed against the carpet. A veil was draped across a chair like shed skin. The champagne bucket, still half filled with ice, sweated in silence, ignored. Becky stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker, when the door opened without a knock. Rachel stepped in, barefoot, her gown rumpled and streaked with mascara. Her face was ghostly pale, but her eyes, though swollen, held a flicker of resolve. For a moment neither spoke. The hush was heavier than the accusations in the side chamber earlier that night. Becky braced herself for more blame, but Rachel's lips trembled with words of a different weight. "I need you to know," Rachel whispered, clutching her arms as if to keep herself from shattering. "I wasn't blind. I saw the cracks. I couldn't move. He cornered me." Becky turned, her breath catching. "Rachel!" Rachel shook her head, hair falling loose from its pins. "Ethan told me if I ever spoke about his debts, his fake contracts, his midnight calls, he'd ruin me. My family would be dragged through the mud. He said I was nothing without him, and I believed him." Her voice broke into sobs, but then steadied, raw honesty laced with fury. "He hid everything behind that smile. He made me complicit with my silence." The confession rolled over Becky like waves, vindication and sorrow colliding. She stepped closer, her soldier's heart softening. "You were trapped. That doesn't make you guilty." Rachel's hands shook as she reached into the clutch bag still dangling from her wrist. She pulled out a slim folder, stuffed with printed emails and contracts marked with Ethan's signature. Her fingers left faint creases as she held it out, almost like an offering. "These," Rachel said, her voice hoarse, "are the copies. He never thought I'd keep them. Fake contracts with investors who don't exist, emails to offshore accounts. Proof he bled everything dry. He destroyed both of us, Becky. Let's finish this." Her knees buckled under the weight of her admission, and Becky caught her, lowering her onto the couch. For the first time, Becky saw Rachel not as a porcelain bride, but as another casualty of Ethan's empire, a woman who had worn chains instead of vows. Becky pressed a hand to Rachel's shoulder, steadying her. "Then we'll bring him down together. He doesn't get to write the ending. We do." The door opened, and Mark stepped in, his coat damp with night air. He held a thick manila folder under his arm, his face set with grim certainty. His eyes flicked from Rachel's tear-streaked face to Becky's steady one. "With this," he said, laying the folder on the table beside Rachel's papers, "Ethan's trial is sealed." Not under chandeliers, but under fluorescent lights, Ethan faced his real audience. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and polish, nothing of grandeur, nothing of wealth. The benches creaked beneath the weight of townsfolk who had once toasted Ethan's rise. Now, they leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle of his fall. The marble floor, scuffed and ordinary, was a cruel mirror for the man who had built his kingdom on gloss and lies. Becky sat among the spectators, her hands folded in her lap, her posture steady. She had no uniform this time, no medals gleaming, only silence sharpened into a blade. The prosecutor stood tall, a stack of documents in hand. His voice cut through the air like a verdict before the verdict. "Ethan Caldwell, you are charged with fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud investors and family holdings. The evidence presented will demonstrate years of deception, deliberate falsification of records, and laundering funds through offshore accounts." Murmurs rippled through the room, whispers that once carried Ethan's praise now reshaped into disbelief and disgust. Rachel took the stand, her trembling masked by a new steel in her voice. She raised her hand, swore her oath, and faced the man she had once promised to marry. Becky watched from the gallery, every syllable Rachel uttered pulling another brick from the fortress Ethan had built. "He threatened me," Rachel said, her voice carrying. "He told me silence was my duty, that his debts weren't mine to expose. He falsified contracts, fabricated investors, and hid losses with new lies. I stayed quiet because I was afraid. Today, I refused that silence." Ethan's jaw tightened, his mask cracking before the court. He turned in his seat, eyes cutting toward Becky. "She's behind this. She poisoned you all against me. She's jealous, bitter. A failure in uniform who wants to see me ruined." His words spilled with venom, but the room no longer bent to his charm. The jury stared back, unmoved, as if his performance had expired. The judge's gavel struck once, the sound reverberating. "Order!" The prosecution laid Sarah's USB files on the record, followed by Rachel's printed contracts, Mark's testimony, and financial charts that mapped the empire's rot in numbers impossible to deny. Every exhibit was another chain fastened around Ethan's wrists. By the time the defense stammered, the trial already felt concluded. Ethan's eyes darted, desperate, but the walls closed in with fluorescent clarity. The judge's voice was final, impartial, carved into stone. "On the charges of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, this court finds the defendant guilty." The gavel slammed down, a sound that cut deeper than applause. Becky exhaled, slow and silent, her composure unbroken even as the weight of years seemed to shift off her shoulders. Around her, whispers rose, the audience feeding on the downfall they had once denied. Ethan twisted, his face blotched with rage, his cuffs glinting under the flat light. He locked eyes with Becky, his voice low but venomous, every syllable a promise rather than a plea. "This isn't over. At dawn, I stood at my father's grave, finally unburdened." The air was crisp, the kind that clung to skin and whispered of endings and beginnings. A thin mist clung to the rows of headstones, softening the edges of marble and memory alike. The grass was still damp with night's tears, soaking through the knees of my slacks as I knelt before the stone that bore my father's name. I laid my hand against the cool granite, letting silence say what words never could. The letter he left me replayed in my mind, each line etched deeper than ink, his warning about Ethan's glittering lies, his plea to protect the family's honor, his faith in me when I had none in myself. For months, that letter had been both weight and compass. Now, for the first time, I felt it lift. From my pocket, I drew the insignia I had carried since the day I left the service. It was scratched, worn, dulled by sand and time. It had followed me through deserts and night watches, through the battlefield of uniform and the battlefield of blood. I pressed it to my lips, then laid it gently against the stone. "For you, Dad, for the Caldwell name." Behind me, footsteps crunched softly against gravel. Mark lingered a few paces back, as if unwilling to intrude on the intimacy of the moment. When I glanced at him, he offered a quiet nod, his presence steady as ever. "Justice doesn't erase pain," he said, voice low but firm. "But it proves truth, and truth is what survives." I looked back at the stone, my throat tight but steady. "You were right, Dad. I kept the Caldwell name clean." The words were little more than breath, but they carried farther than I imagined, out across the cemetery, where dawn was prying open the sky with streaks of gold. Ethan's shadow still lingered in whispers around town, in the hollow eyes of those who had believed in him, in the stain of what he'd nearly destroyed. But his empire was ash now, his voice silenced by bars and verdicts. Rachel had stepped free of his chains. Sarah's courage had given weight to the truth. And Mark, he had been my anchor when the tide threatened to drag me under. I rose slowly, brushing dew from my hands, the insignia gleaming faintly against the grave. The ache inside me was still there, but it was no longer sharp. It had settled into something quieter, something that felt like strength rather than wound. The horizon pulled my gaze, pale pink and amber spilling across the sky, the kind of light that promised more than survival. I breathed it in, shoulders squared, heart lighter than it had been in years. I turned from the grave, my steps carrying me toward that rising sun. Justice had come late, but it had come whole. And beyond vengeance, beyond loss, there was still a life waiting to be lived. The path from betrayal to justice was steep and brutal, but in the end, truth shattered the lies that once seemed unshakable. Ethan's fall proved that arrogance and deceit can glitter for a while, yet they collapse under the steady weight of courage and evidence. When injustice is met with unwavering resolve, the verdict echoes louder than the crime, reminding us that justice delayed is not justice denied. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. Like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Type 1 if you felt her fight as your own. Type 2 if you think justice still left something to be desired.